Okay, everybody. I just want to touch on some notes here on ATP and then leaf anatomy, and then you'll spend the rest of your day working on understanding photosynthesis. So, the first part of your interactive notebook up to page 5 was dealing with the new root words. Don't forget those, they're important and really useful, especially when you start getting into these more complex topics, right? To be able to use your root words to break down things. So, to kind of key out where you should be at roughly at this point, starting on page 6, remember last week we talked a little bit about what ATP stands for. Remember, ATP, for our purposes, it's like I always think of as the dollar bill of the cell, right? The sort of most useful currency in the cell. What we're going to learn later, and I like to use this analogy, right, is that photosynthesis really makes glucose. But glucose is like lightning to the cell, right? It's the bonds in glucose, if they're broken, can cause damage to the cell. So somehow there has to be a conversion process, and we're going to get into this, where glucose is ultimately turned into ATP, which is much more useful for the cell. So another analogy or metaphor, or whatever I like to use, is thinking of glucose as like a $100 bill, right? So photosynthesis is printing out $100 bills. And $100 bills are very useful, right? Who doesn't want $100 bills? But they're not very useful if I go over to the vending machine and I want to get myself a, bag of carrots or whatever, um, because the vending machine only takes dollars, let's say. So we need a conversion process, right, to turn that glucose, which is sort of like the $100, into the ATP, which is kind of like the dollar. So the ATP is a lower energy molecule. So an important, very important, and ubiquitous molecule. In other words, it's all over nature, all over inside of cells. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. And really, remember from last week, the main thing we want to think about is that if bonds are broken in chemistry, we're generally releasing energy. When bonds form, we're storing energy. So ATP is a lot of sort of stored energy, right? It's fully charged. When that bond breaks between the last two phosphate groups, now we have ADP, and we're able to use a little bit of that energy. So, this would be one way you could have made your concept map if you took the time to do this. Everything we're talking about here is chemical energy, right? And when you form bonds, you store energy. When you break bonds, you release energy. And then the ones most closely associated with that, right, as examples, ADP over here and ATP over there. They're made of the same stuff, right? The same parts, monomers, remember that? Ribose, right, a sugar, the nitrogen base. And then it's really just how many phosphate groups are there. But again, the main thing we're worried about is right here, this little phosphate group at the end, right, that bond that exists there is where the energy is that the cell can use. Okay, so we reviewed these things last week, autotrophs, heterotrophs. Remember, we're talking about self-feeders in the case of an autotroph, and in the case of a heterotroph, they're different feeders, hetero meaning different. So in other words, they have to get their food from something else. So we are heterotrophs, right? We can't make our own food. Plants generally are autotrophs, right? They can make their own food via the process of photosynthesis. But in order to be able to do that, they have to have structures in place that can do that work for them. And so the main structure to do that work, the work of photosynthesis, is the chloroplast. And we looked at this last week a little bit. And I don't expect you to know every single part of it. I want you to know the green pancakes, remember, the thylakoid, right? A stack of those. It's called a granum. And then I like to think of like the syrup surrounding them, right? The fluid surrounding the green pancakes is called the stroma. And so we're going to talk about what takes place in each of those locations. But that's how autotrophs make their food that then heterotrophs have an opportunity to consume. So without autotrophs, remember, without the plants, the rest of us are kind of out of luck, right? So we need this process. Everybody does. So there's the chemical equation again. You take some carbon dioxide, some water, and in the presence of light, in the presence of chlorophyll, in the presence of a lot of enzymes, a lot of processes going on, you can turn out glucose and oxygen from the photosynthesis process. So, taking a closer look at how the solar panels of plants work, right? So in other words, what are the cell types in a plant that do photosynthesis? And I like to think of it as, where would you put your solar panels on your house, right? You're not going to put them down in your basement. And so the solar panels for plants are up in the sun, up by the leaves. So again, solar panels, you're going to put those on the roof, right? That's where the sun is. So plant cells, right, they're not all green, right? They're not all doing photosynthesis work. That's important to understand, right? A seed that's put underground is still plant cells, but it's not doing photosynthesis just because it's a plant, right? How could it do photosynthesis if it's buried underground, right? And roots of trees and plants, right? They're not doing photosynthesis because they don't have chlorophyll A and B in them. So we're going to take a closer look at leaves, which of course do have the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts in them normally, right? This time of year, that tends to be, they tend to break down and get lost, and they're not being made as efficiently anymore. Okay, so, shoot. Leaf anatomy, right? Here are the topics using the pages from the book to talk about what some of these different things do, right? And leaves are probably much more complex than most of us would normally think, right? Just looking at it. But you put them under the microscope, which we would do in class normally, and you see all these different structures, right? Any plant that's taller than, a couple centimeters is considered vascular, which means it has vessels that carry around, if we talk about our vascular tissue, we're talking about our blood vessels, right? In plants, it's xylem and phloem. And so they have the capacity to move liquids and minerals around inside of them and the sugars that are made by the leaves around inside of them. And that's really what the xylem and phloem do. So a couple big things, right, when we're looking at a leaf here. If you take a look, this palisade mesophyll, right, this upper layer, notice all the green in it. That would make sense, right? That's where the sunlight is hitting, that's where the chlorophyll A and B is being activated, so it makes sense that these cells have the majority of the chloroplasts in them. Now, there are other areas, the spongy mesophyll, and it's spongy mesophyll because there's air space here, and that's important, right? The cell keeps water vapors and air vapors in here. And then the xylem and the phloem, I always think xylem up, right? Bringing up water and minerals and the things from the ground that a plant needs, phloem down. And that's really bringing the sugars that are made by the leaf to the rest of the plant that needs those sugars to survive, because the cells need those for metabolism to be able to survive. And then probably the coolest thing about leaves, and again, we would have done this in one of my favorite labs, but we would have done this in class. They have little mouths called stoma, and they can stomata or stoma, depending on if you're talking about them in plural or singular. They can actually open and close. So believe it or not, on the bottom side of leaves, right, are little mouths that open and close. And those allow air in, they allow water vapor out at times. So they really regulate what's going on, specifically in the spongy mesophyll, right? They allow air in there or they allow air out, depending on what needs to happen. So if we had been back in class, back in a lab, you would have looked at some lilac leaves, a cross-section of a lilac leaf. So this would be the top of the leaf, and here's the bottom of the leaf, and here's the spongy mesophyll. You can kind of see the air spaces. And we would have seen this in lab. You can see those little mouths, right? They look kind of like little mouths, and they can open and close based on actually water pressure, turgor pressure in the guard cells surrounding the little mouth. So who knew, right, that plants rather, leaves have little mouths on the bottom of them. So remember, structure and function. So the major function of leaves is to provide gas exchange and to capture light. So what does that mean? Well, it's carrying out photosynthesis. And how does it do that? Well, it does that with the structures of chloroplasts, which contain the pigment chlorophyll in them, and that, of course, makes them green. This time of year, like I said, once that chlorophyll starts to become not as useful because the light's going away and the plant's trying to conserve its energy, that chlorophyll goes away, and you end up getting different pigments, which is what turns the leaves to the reds and the other colors other than green and ultimately brown before they fall off. Okay, so where does the chlorophyll exist? In three cell types within a leaf: the palisade mesophyll, the spongy mesophyll, and the guard cells. The xylem and the phloem don't have it. The root cells don't have that pigment because they wouldn't need it. Okay, so the stoma do a lot for you. If anybody grows tomato plants, I like to grow tomato plants every year. One of the things you want to be very careful of is when you water your tomato plants, because if you splash mud on the bottom of the leaves and those little stoma are open, it introduces dirt and potentially infections, right? Bacteria and other things that can blight your tomato plants into the leaf, right? So if you water at the correct times, and you don't want to splash mud on the bottoms of your leaves, you can keep your plants healthier. Just sort of one of those application pieces. Okay, so that's it. Now we're going to move into photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis. So how do those pigments, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, within inside a chloroplast, do their job? How do they make glucose from carbon dioxide and water? And how do we get the byproduct of oxygen? Now, there's a lot going on here, and we're going to simplify it down, I hope, to a fairly simple way of thinking about it in a diagram. So we'll get to that. You'll get introduced to that today, and we'll kind of talk about that again more tomorrow. Take care, everybody. We'll see you soon.